Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Politics from the Penn Political Review at the University of Pennsylvania, a podcast where we bring experts on various topics from campus to talk about current events. My name's Haven Lerner.
And my name is Amira Chowdhury.
We'll be your host for today.
We're here with Dr. Adolph Jr. He's a professor of political science here at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Reed's research interests include American and Afro-American politics and political thought, urban politics, and American political development. He was also a staffer in the 2016 Bernie Sanders presidential election campaign. Is there anything else the audience should know about you, Professor?
No, not really. That's enough.
All right, so then we're going to dive right into the questions,
Okay.
Professor.
Yep.
So, Professor, you have commented a lot on the idea of and commitment to idea politics in the past.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about identity politics, and what do you think identity politics means in American politics today?
Today, yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, it may have meant something else at some point in the past, but at this point, more and more, as a good friend and collaborator of mine, who's an English professor actually, Walter Ben Michaels, and I have been saying for close to 20 years, the model of an ideal society that identity politics, or what's typically described as identity politics, we can maybe come back and say a little more about what that is. But that what's understood as identity politics rests on is one in which the society could be considered just if 1% of the population controlled more than 90% of the resources, so long as half of that 1% were female, 13% were black, 14% were Latino, the appropriate percentages were gay and lesbian, and whatever else counts. And that's a notion of a just society, certainly, but it's a notion of a just society that leaves the vast majority of us out of it, and it's not one that I find especially exciting. And often enough, people, especially liberals, will say is that but in the currently existing moment, the two options that we have are basically one neoliberal party that embraces diversity and multiculturalism, and a neoliberal party that rejects diversity and multiculturalism. And the liberals will say, isn't the former better than the latter? And I will have to say, yeah, sure. If those are the only imaginable options for a good society, then the liberal one is less worse than the other one. But from my perspective, which I think is a perspective that's more focused on the magnitude of gross inequality, it's that the appropriate response to those being the only two options is to demand some other options.
Understood. How do you think, how does identity politics appear on both the right and left sides of the political spectrum?
That's also a good question. What's often called white nationalism or right-wing populism, right, is a kind of identity politics, right? And I mean, there's a kind of, it's an interesting sort of relation between Obama's self-presentation and Trump's self-presentation, and people typically don't like to think about that. But Obama ran in 2008 on a claim that he embodied, right, the aspirations of all of the downtrodden in his person because of who he is, because of his story, right? And Trump kind of did the same thing, right? Don't get me wrong, Trump is Trump, right? He's a psychopath and he's completely dangerous, probably clinical narcissist and totally opportunistic. Mm-hmm. And those are his good qualities. But what's happened though is that steadily since the Reagan era, frankly, and the Clinton administration is like the punctuation point for this, we've seen debate in national politics move farther and farther away from concerns with downwardly redistributive policy agendas, mm-hmm. right, and an acceptance of a bipartisan acceptance of the limits of neoliberal policy orientation for the country.
On the topic of policy agendas that drive this type of identity politics, you've commented in the past that some liberals pay too much attention to identity politics by focusing too much on racial divisions in our
Right.
society. So, Professor, what role do you think racial concerns should play in progressive politics today?
Okay. Wow. Well, that's a good one and a big one. Look, I mean, it's easy or it's natural, right? Given assumptions about how we've all been conditioned to think about politics and justice and inequality over the last 20, 25 years. It's easy to see like the racial or the gender dimension as what's causing apparent inequalities, right? But I'll give you an illustration I was writing about, just last night, I've written about before. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, right, if you looked at who was stranded and left out and stuck in the convention center and on the overpasses and wherever else, you would think, which people did, right? And I'll finish one sentence before I start another one. You would think that it was easy to think anyway that this was an illustration of the depth of racial injustice that persisted like in New Orleans, on the Gulf Coast, and in society writ large. But when you pull back a little bit, what data eventually showed was that black people may have been displaced at slightly higher rates than whites, but water makes up its own mind about where it's going to go. If you live in flood country, you know that, right? And in fact, like the upscale, Lakeview neighborhood that was more than 90% white was flooded just as badly as the lower Ninth Ward was. 90% white. Jefferson Parish that actually abuts the lower Ninth Ward was completely underwater. Didn't have a school or a hospital operating for more than a year afterward. But beyond that, the better predictor of who was able to evacuate and who wasn't, who was able to evacuate under the most commodious possible conditions, and who was forced to evacuate under the worst, who was able to spend the time of exile, right? And I'll say something kind of funny about that in a second too. Under decent conditions, and who was on the floor of the Astrodome and that kind of stuff. Who was able to come back? How soon? A better predictor than race was resources possessed prior to the storm, right? Middle class black people did much better, and obviously, I don't diminish the significance of the flood and the horrors and the almost perfidy, right, of the Bush administration. All my family in New Orleans, was displaced for months, right? But the people who actually had it worst were the poorest, and that kind of makes sense. So it's easy to see, it's natural at this point, to see race as a kind of screen or a sort of shorthand for economic inequality. But the problem with taking the shorthand to be the cause, or the symptom to be the cause, if you want to put it that way, or symptomatic expression to be the cause, is that you never really look at the cause. And what you've seen in the class is that if you don't do that, then you also don't notice the class dynamics that are operating in what's called black politics, and who actually gets to shape the agendas, and who benefits from those agendas and who doesn't. So I don't know, that's maybe kind of a little long-winded. Oh, but the one thing I was going to say was about the exile thing. I think a couple of months after the city was flooded, or maybe a couple of weeks after the city was flooded, the people who like to write bombastic stuff on the internet, right, and what I sort of call sometimes the internet fundraising left, were going on about how it was outrageous to call people who had been displaced from the Gulf Coast refugees, because to call them refugees implied that they weren't citizens, so forth and so on. And I don't know where they got that from, right? But in December. So I mean, don't forget, like the hurricane made landfall at the end of August. So in early December, I was at a meeting in South Carolina, and I was asked to give an account of what was going on down there because I'd been down there once, about a month and a half before. And a woman who I knew well, I worked with her, and she didn't mean anything bad by it because we had good relationships. But I made a reference to my own family being refugees, and she stopped me and corrected me for using that word because it doesn't give them proper respect, basically. And I just stood there thinking, oh, all right, so I don't get to call my own family, right? I'm refugees because there's this sort of palace politics that assigns sort of deep and significant meaning to really transient terms, right? So it's kind of a performative politics, right? It's actually what a good friend of mine has called the pageantry of protest, and that's kind of what we have for a left now, largely.
So some people have said that it's still possible to criticize racial inequalities in society as it still gets at problems inherent within the system. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, look, I mean, see, I did an interview a little while ago, and like the interviewer asked me about, the class first line, right? And I pointed out that well, I mean, nobody really denies the existence of racial inequality, right? And nobody really at least nobody on the left or that I'm associated with, right, among those people who get castigated as being class first, right? I mean, nobody, believes that racism doesn't exist, and I said, and as I said on the Ontario podcast, I mean, I'd be out of my mind. Like I grew up largely in the Jim Crow South, so how could I possibly think there's no such thing as racism, right? But the question is whether race explains the sources, either the sources of the inequalities, or the appropriate means for addressing them, right? And that's where the debate comes in. Right? Even police killings, right? I mean, yes, from the looks of things, it's quite like who was on the overpasses after Katrina. From the looks of things, blacks are killed by police in overwhelming disproportion. But actually, things are more complicated than that. People who live in certain kind of neighborhoods, right, that are targeted for stress policing, are killed at much higher rates than others. And if you take a black Yale graduate or Penn graduate stockbroker who gets jacked up by the police, say on the Metro North platform, right? And this happened to like a very rich former Yale student in the 90s, and it was all over the Times. That person is certainly more likely to be jacked up than his or her white counterpart, right? From the same background is to be jacked up. But he's also going to be much less likely to be jacked up than the black or Puerto Rican or even white young person who lives in one of these neighborhoods that's targeted for stress policing. And I did a little article on this a couple of years ago about that actually focused on police killings, and blacks are killed at a higher rate than anybody else, but a lot of white people are killed too. And I think actually, in absolute numbers, right, there may have been more whites killed, but I might not be right about that. It doesn't make any difference. But also, like, since I'm on this topic, one of the big trump cards, no pun intended, in what I would call the race first line, basically, is to point to or to disparage like the New Deal, right, on the argument that racism and the racial inequality were built into the New Deal, and blacks suffered and just made everything worse. And it's funny because in my undergraduate urban politics class, I focus on we discuss the implications or how New Deal programs affected housing policy and housing markets. But it never occurred to me for the first 2 or 3 years I taught it that the takeaway that students would take from that is that the New Deal programs created segregation, right? And that the government created segregation. And then I remembered, well, I'm living in a world now where all of the undergraduates have grown up within the context of hegemonic neoliberal understandings and castigation of government. So I've had to change the way that I teach that. But the fact is, right, because the big story, right, has been, and well-intentioned scholars started doing this like at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. The big trump, again, no pun intended, is a claim that, or is to point to the Social Security program, right? Because everybody knows, right? I bet you could walk out of here and stop somebody across the street and ask them, right, about Social Security, and they would say this to you. Well, they might anyway. That 3/4 of black workers were excluded from initial coverage under the Social Security program because they were domestic or agricultural workers. Now, obviously, Southern employers didn't want any of their low-wage workforce to have access to Social Security benefits because their interest is in making certain that this workforce was so tractable that they had no alternative other than to accept work on whatever conditions employers wanted to offer. And there's no question that there's a whole lot of racial ideology that was all tied up in the justifications that they made for it. But the reality is there too. While 75 or so % of black workers were excluded, actually 75% or 74%, right, but who's quibbling, of the workers who were excluded under each of those categories were white, right? And like you don't have to be a statistical genius to figure out why that is. So so that means it's likely that there was something else going on besides racism, right? And plus there were very few black agricultural workers in the West, and employers in the West were just as bitterly opposed to those workers being covered. Where a lot of them were Latino, but a lot of them were also white, right? When someone, and Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which is kind of a Bible for this sort of argument. I found it a very frustrating book because she keeps saying all the way through, she keeps teasing us with, this is just like Jim Crow, just like Jim Crow, just like Jim Crow, and I'm getting frustrated because I want to see what the argument is. And then eventually even she has to say, well, it's not really, right? So then the question is, well, what's so appealing about invoking that historical analogy if even the people who invoke it acknowledge that it doesn't really work? And it has has much more to do with supporting a claim that every kind of inequality, every dimension of inequality that has a negative effect on black people has to be discussed in the language of racism, right? And that's a political statement, and it's a statement I have argued of a class politics in the here and now, right? I guess the other thing I was going to, the reason that I brought her up, and by the way, was that she at one point in the book acknowledges, it's pretty early on as I recall, that that very many, if not most of the people in objective terms who are swept up in the carceral apparatus are white, and her response to that is that they're collateral damage, right? And frankly, that just sounds like something that you'd expect from the Fruit of Islam guy who's trying to sell you a bean pie in the corner, right? But anyway, I think I've gone on too long about that answer too. So
No,
I'll be quiet.
Professor, you're just fine. We're actually going to take a turn towards economic politics
Oh, okay,
and just
very
discuss
good.
that for a second. So, Professor, you've written about the importance of intentional economic policies in changing the way society is structured for different groups of people.
Right.
So, Professor, what specific policies would you like to see enacted that would help reshape society, especially for low-income and working folks?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I mean, the easy answer would be just go look at the Sanders campaign program, but no. I mean, obviously, raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour. Make it a lot easier. Tilt the playing field back toward level for the labor movement to make it more less onerous, right? And there are a number of ways to do that, small and large, but with a federal commitment. In 1945, a real full employment bill passed the U.S. Senate, and it's a bill that would have mandated that full employment be like the centerpiece of federal economic policy, and would have required the executive branch, right, the presidency, to get annual forecasts from the Council of Economic Advisors, which and others. I mean, the Council of Economic Advisors was actually created by the watered-down version of the bill that passed the next year. But it would have required the presidency to establish targets for unemployment. And while it didn't set any specific numbers, liberal economists generally considered that 2 to 3% would be the threshold and the goal. And the way the bill operated was that when unemployment rose above whatever the target was, then the executive branch should mandate any and all efforts necessary to bring it down, including federal jobs programs, right? And God knows we need federal jobs programs now, right? I mean, not just for unemployment, but because of all the stuff that needs to be done. I mean, I've often said in my urban class, and a friend of mine who came to visit the class one night, a union leader, said it hadn't occurred to him, but it's true. Like almost every two or 3 weeks for at least a month, for at least 6 months, there was a water main break someplace in the city of Philadelphia, right? And I mean, like the local news treated each one like it was a one-off, and like nobody connected the dots. But there's stuff like that all over the country. But social infrastructure, right? I mean, so for instance, I think economists don't like to think of this sort of thing as economic policy, but also massive public investment, stuff like free publicly provided daycare and elder care, right? And this, by the way, into the 80s was a top item on the agenda of the women's movement until the Sheryl Sandberg tendency started to win a lot of the women's movement. Affordable housing. What else? I mean, free public higher education. And other stuff of that sort. But also, look, you can't do any of that. Well, part of this is a retraction from a foreign policy, foreign economic and military policy that props up governments that suppress the rights of working people at home. So, and that means hands off Venezuela, right, among other things.
Yeah. So, the Democratic Party and even the Republican Party, to a certain extent, have adopted more economically populist positions in recent years. Why do you think that is, and what do you think drives that?
Well, they haven't really. I mean, they've talked about it, right? I mean, they explore the rhetoric, right? But if you look, right? I mean, both parties are, well, look, I mean, here's what's a better example than the carte blanche that Barack Obama had when he was elected in 2008, right? He had both houses of Congress and a population that was ready to go rip the heads off the investment bankers, right? Mm-hmm. And he saw his role as being exactly the opposite, right? There's a famous story of of the first meeting that he had with the heads of the big Wall Street houses, where he says, I'm the only thing that stands between you and the pitchforks, right? When he should have gone in there with a pitchfork, right? So there's all this chatter back and forth about Main Street versus Wall Street and so forth and so on, but the only aspirant for national executive office, right, who has put his money where the rhetoric is programmatically is Senator Sanders. So, but yeah, I mean, like the idea that Trump is a populist is like, so outrageous. But I was listening to the BBC on the way down here today for my sins. Right, that's like part of my penance, keep me out of purgatory. But or if there still is purgatory, I think they may have killed it. But the way that populism rolls so easily off the tongues of the chattering classes, right? Without any clarity about what that's supposed to refer to, right? But it's much more an emotional reference than it is like a substantive one, right? And it's another way. Like I can send you guys some articles, with some nice stuff. I'll send them to you. You can get them to him. That take this question up about Europe, because there's left populism and there's right populism, and right populism is basically the same thing as a reactionary nationalism, right? But if you look at what happens, right, the so-called populist regimes that have come to power in places like the former Soviet socialist republics, or in India, right, or where else? Brazil with the clown Bolsonaro, and there were a couple other places. Poland. They're reactionaries politically, and anti-abortion and sexist and so forth and so on, and homophobic and dangerous, like, and horrible in many, many ways. But they also keep the lines open to Wall Street. So that's as far as the nationalism goes, basically.
On the topic of the rhetoric of populism and that effect, I want to zero down on a specific movement within our country.
Okay.
So, Professor, do you think Trump's support derives from his economic populism rhetoric, such as his criticism of trade deals or wanting to preserve Social Security and Medicaid, which we all know what's happening with that, or do you think it comes from his racial rhetoric?
Okay. Well, of course, it's probably some of column A and some of column B, right? But for me, and see, this is one of the problems with the debate now, and I'll come back and say something maybe a little provocative about that in a moment. You can look at Trump support in two ways. Either, this just shows how deeply racist, right, American society is, how transphobic, how xenophobic, how sexist, and misogynist. And you can certainly find as much of that as you want to find in Trump's base. But there will also, another way to look at it is that according to the best numbers that I've seen, somewhere between 6.5 and 9 million people who voted for Trump voted for Sanders and Obama at least once. So it's not, if it is racism, like, it's not a simple kind of racism, right? And what it says from the standpoint of somebody who looks at politics from trying to figure out how to go about building a majority winning coalition in support of a progressive redistributivist agenda, to me that's the good news, right? But now the more provocative, because that says that there are ways, and people I work with in my other life, right, have focused on this objective, like for 2022, that the challenge for us is to figure out ways to connect working people, right? Like without regard to race, gender, and by working people, I mean everybody who works for a living, and I mean even if they consider themselves to be professionals, right? And is potentially precarious, around a redistributive agenda that turns the playing field back in our direction, and is motivated by the question, what would this society look like if it were governed by and in the interest of the vast majority of people who actually live in it? So then the question is, okay, well, how do you appeal to people to try to build that kind of coalition? Well, I mean, the only way to do it is to connect with them around common concerns, right? And one of the problems, just, and this may be kind of cheap, but one of the limitations I've never been able to understand about the appeal of identity politics is I don't see how we're ever supposed to build the fundamental solidarities that we need to win anything if we have to start out by going around the room, making sure everybody understands just how different we are from one another, right? Because you start from the other way, and to resolve whatever the differences are on the basis of the mutually understood solidarities. But here's the other thing: what I have noticed during the 2016 campaign, and more so after, is the formation of something like a de facto alliance between what I would call the identitarian wing of the Democratic Party and the nominal left, and the Wall Street wing, right? And both around, the notions that, a claim, well, it's come down to a claim that calling for economic redistribution is itself somehow racist, right? Or sexist, right? And what intrigues me about that is not so much that the black and brown or the people of color, the professional and managerial strata who are into that kind of politics and would do that, or the bourgeois feminists would do it. But what strikes me as kind of odd about it is that so many people who understand themselves to be on the left, and even on the radical left, right? People who attack people like me for not being left enough, can't see somehow that the politics that they're aligning themselves with is also the politics that Wall Street, right, or that the Democratic side of Wall Street is aligning itself with. So how does that work? So anyway.
So moving to the other side of the aisle, you've said you think it's unfair to criticize Bernie Sanders for a lack of attention to racial issues. Could you explain why you think that it's unfair? Oh,
sure. Well, because in the first place, he's never not attended to racial issues. So in that sense, it's a lie. But also, and this is something that I encountered a fair amount on the campaign, and people would ask the question, mainly black people, but not only. I would ask the question either more or less ingenuously, right? But every time I responded the same way. I would go down the platform, item by item, right, and ask, okay, so wouldn't this be an issue that if we won this would have disproportionately beneficial impacts on blacks and Latinos? And whenever I talk to working people, and I mean, this may sound like hooey, but it's really true in my recollection anyway. But whenever I talk to working people, I would see it and say, yeah, well, that's right. It's only when I would talk to people like in our class, right, the class that benefits from the political economy of race relations, basically, who would hold off and would press against it. Because you know what, another part of this story is that, and I spent a lot of time in the labor movement, with rank and file workers too. People who work for a living kind of understand, right, and especially, okay, if they're in unions especially, but they understand that among their closest solidarities are those with people who share their everyday condition, right? And I want to be careful in the way I express that, but I'll give you an analogy. When I lived in Chicago in the mid '90s, where I just happened to be in the birthing room at the outset of Obama's political career, which was kind of interesting, but especially watching the way that the white liberals and the NGO types loved him. But one of the kind of little pet projects of the left, like the reparations thing is now, right, or something else, was the Mumia Abu Jamal movement, right? You probably don't know who he is, but it's a Philadelphia case. He was a Black Panther at one point. He's in jail for having killed this cop, and it seems to me there's no question but that he was railroaded. But I'm also open to the possibility that he might have been guilty, right? I mean, somebody killed the cop. The cop was there. He was there, and Mumia's brother was there. So there are only two possibilities if you assume the cop didn't commit suicide. But anyway, that's not the point. But like leftists of various sorts were treating the Mumia thing as a litmus test, right? About being genuinely in a support of the people of color radical movement. And I mean, I lived in a 3-flat then, and my neighbors on the second floor was a couple, nice couple, both black. The guy was an electrician who was a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, just like my cousin in New Orleans. And the woman was a city worker who had been part of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees bargaining unit until she was promoted out of the bargaining unit. They both had, really good, solid politics of a progressive sort. I mean, they weren't really activists or anything like that. And I thought about them in this regard because I knew that if I had taken them a petition to sign asking for a fair trial for Mumia and explained to them how he was railroaded, they certainly would have signed it. But it's not like that's one of the top 25 or 35 or even 50 things that they would write down if they were asked what their main political concerns were, because people are concerned about material stuff, basically, right? And so I think it's like that, right? I mean, and the dirty little secret here, right, is that the people who make their living as or want to make their living, or try to make their living as being spokesmodels, basically, for the black community or Latino community or whatever, really don't want to see rank and file people become involved in political coalitions that transcend the racial boundaries, right? Because then they're acting because then the people are acting independently, and the role for the racial voice just disappears or is exposed as inadequate. So, for instance, last fall, when the torrent of panels of POC talking heads on like MSNBC and elsewhere was bleating loudest that Sanders has a race problem, polls started showing that Sanders' approval ratings were higher with black Americans than among any other Democratic constituency, because they could see what he stands for. So that's why that's why I think we're going to try to win in South Carolina this time. Send a message.
Okay. Yeah. So, speaking to continue on this topic,
uh-huh.
Some people have said that there are certain racial issues that can't be addressed through more generalized economic policy, such
mm-hmm.
as the racial wealth gap disparity, and as you said, the topic of reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any truth to that?
No. Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Right. I saw some recent the research that seems to indicate that when you dig down deeply enough, turns out that the racial wealth gap is most fundamentally a racial income gap. And what that means then is that income policies, right, and tightening the labor market, and other redistributive policies would be the way to address, the so-called wealth gap. Another funny thing about this is a colleague of mine and I did an article on a disparities discourse a few years ago, and one of the things we were kind of shocked to find, because like the Bible for disparity studies is Melvin Oliver, and I think Thomas Shapiro's Black Wealth, White Wealth. It came out in the mid-'90s. Everybody read that, and then there was another little book that came out a year or two later by Dalton Conley that a lot of people had but didn't bother to read, because everybody said it basically was an affirmation of the Oliver and Shapiro findings. So my colleague and I read it independently of each other. He was a Penn grad student back in the day, by the way. And we're both kind of startled to find out that one thing that Conley did was, when he imposed more stringent class controls, right, like to take in stuff like where parents had gone to school, right, that kind of thing, that it turns out that at the upper class, because the punchline of the racial wealth gap story has been that the gap persists all the way up, right, to the top. And it turns out that when you get to those black people whose class backgrounds are the same as their white peers for a couple of generations or more, then almost all of the wealth gap disappears. So what that suggests is that, in part, the wealth gap is a function of the relatively lower amount of time that the black upper class has been around to accumulate wealth. So, but there are a lot of other problems with the wealth gap thing, right? Because among other things, some of them, it's a lot easier to talk about the wealth gap, right? Because the wealth gap functions mainly in a rhetorical way, right? To enable saying, see, there's still racism, and racial disparity, first of all, doesn't necessarily equal racism. Like, to point to a disparity doesn't explain how the disparity is produced and maintained over time. People will say, well, see, it's racism, and basically cross themselves, but that's an alternative to an explanation. Like, it's not an explanation. On the reparations thing, it's funny. Like, at the end of the last century, I was out of the country for a month, and I was someplace where I didn't have access to U.S. or to American news and stuff. And I came back, both kind of disappointed to learn that Johnny Taylor, the singer, had died in my absence, but also to learn that the reparations stuff had popped up, and it was all over the place. Right, there were people on news panels and stuff, and I knew about this, right, from the late '60s, and from seeing people calling for it on soapboxes in Harlem and stuff. But I was startled to see that it had become kind of a respectable thing, but my question, my first question, right, has always been the same about this, right, and it came up on another podcast interview I did a couple of weeks ago. How can you imagine putting together a political alliance that could prevail on this issue, in any form, right? And it's not a matter of even saying that white people won't support it because they're racist. Yeah, that's probably true in a lot of cases. But the more important point is that people won't support it, won't be inclined to support it, because they don't get anything out of it, right? And in some cases, it's really crazy, inflammatory, like a provocateur. Maulana Ron Karenga proposed in this earlier uptick that that the federal government pay for black people to go to college. And I was talking to my son about this. We're thinking, oh my God, like, can you imagine, going into the distressed Midwest, where like all these white people can't figure out how their kids are going to go to school, and then you hear, a program calling for taking federal tax money to pay for black kids to go to college. I mean, that's the equivalent of recruiting for the Klan, basically. And from the class too, Amira, that people like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and even King and others, right? I mean, understood that the only safe way to win benefits for black Americans is to win them for all Americans, right? Because otherwise you get, that's what happened, so-called welfare, right? I mean, aid to families with dependent children. So the reparations thing to me has always been a non-starter, and it's been a fanciful notion, but it's also done the same kind of work that the disparities talk does, and the new Jim Crow talk does, and its main function is to insist that we take race as a conceptual frame of reference, however that would work, for discussing any kind of inequality that affects black people in statistically significant ways. And I mean, just because, so like in that sense, it's a political, what's an ideological claim, right? And frankly, I mean, and we can see it. Like I saw it on the podcast even, because the thing was, well, can't you get can't we get Bernie to embrace some idea like reparations, even if it means just talking about it, which my son, who's an historian, now describes as the reparations advocates having come into what he calls the peace with honor period, which is a reference to the moment in Vietnam under the Nixon administration where they realized that they'd lost, so they wanted to find a way to declare victory and go home. So now, I mean, like the new, who introduced the bill? I forget now. Sheila Jackson Lee has introduced a new bill, and I think this kind of stuff is directed toward, because she's no radical either, but is directed toward establishing the terms of debate in the Democratic race for 2016. That makes race the key issue, and pushes to the sideline economic redistribution, because this bill just calls for talking about it, right? So what is that, right? I mean, just saying the word, right? Like in the same way that we've seen through the Black Lives Matter stuff, calls for saying the word or speaking somebody's name. So no, I think it's an absolute non-starter and worse than a distraction.
Professor, we spend a lot of time going over different aspects of politics, and we're now coming to the end portion of our segment. So I'm going to ask a final question, which has multiple questions in it.
Okay.
So it's like a grand final question.
Okay. Ta-da.
Exactly. So, Professor, based on your experience, your heavy experience in organizing activism, and most importantly, academia, have you ever considered running for public office? That's the first question.
Okay.
And what do you believe would be the most meaningful form of public service for an individual in America? Should that be running for office, or would that be organizing at the local level? And in your view, how can one make meaningful contributions in politics and public sphere without serving, as you would describe, as the hologram mouthpiece for the system?
Wow, yeah, well, that's true. Okay, that's right. There are a bunch of questions there. Yeah. They're all good. I mean, no, there are a number of reasons I've never considered running for public office. Like, I've worked for candidates over the years. Yeah. But there are a lot of them. Like, I'm not suited to it, right? But the other thing about it is, the way that our electoral system operates, right? But I mean, I know I said this in class not that long ago, that really, I mean, nobody who aspires to high public office in this system will be somebody you want for your brother-in-law or for your sister-in-law. They won't be the kind of person you want to sit across the Thanksgiving turkey from, because they're going to be somewhat egotistical and narcissistically driven. And I say that, I think I said this in class too, but Paul Wellstone, the late senator from Minnesota, was a very good friend of mine from college until he died, and I had all the respect in the world for him. But I say that, having been Paul's friend for a long time, right? I mean, and when I was involved in our effort to build a Labor Party, one of the constant tensions that we had was people wanting to run for office or run candidates for office, what we thought was prematurely, right? Because the worst thing that can happen is you get somebody elected and you can't control them, right? And in most cases you can't, right? Because of the way that the system goes. I may have said this in class too, or maybe it was in a bar to somebody, but we as progressives, right, as like people who are concerned with improving the conditions of the working people and the mass of the society, actually got more from Richard Nixon's presidency than we got from any of the three Democrats who've come after him. And that's obviously not because Nixon liked us anymore. He didn't. He hated us. He hated us completely. And I'm sure that when each of at least Clinton, I'm less sure, ironically, about Carter or Obama, but I think like when each of them had their crisis of conscience at 3:00 in the morning and was staring at themselves in the bathroom mirror, they really thought that they liked us, right? But so, I mean, what's the difference? The difference is that when Nixon was in office, the social movements that advanced like the interests of working folks of all sorts were stronger and had more clout and contributed to shaping the hologram, right? But Carter, Clinton, and Obama, when they were in the White House, Carter was just lost, I think. And Clinton actually helped to marginalize us, and Obama did too. So I mean they you might say, well, I've often said actually that Carter was a warm-up act for Reagan, and Clinton basically consolidated Reaganite neoliberalism as the limit of left aspiration, and then Obama came and like gave it the the racial success story view. So I mean, in that sense, I mean, and I'm pretty old-fashioned about this stuff. I mean, we didn't get into this circumstance overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. So that means there's a whole lot of stuff, right? A whole lot of ways that people can plug in and do good and useful, important work. Academics, for instance, right? I mean, from a comment you made in a class about how this course, like in the first few weeks, had blown your the AP African American History course out of the water. I mean, like we need, and there are people doing more careful, less orthodox, right? Scholarship now from a critical perspective, and there's a big need for that. But there's big need for movement lawyers. I mean, not too many, but enough. And I mean for organizers, right? I mean, because the only way that we're gonna, and see, this is another peeve. I mean, the social media stuff, the strategy that assumes that what we want to do is shoot our way onto MSNBC, right, where we can get the message out to the broad masses, to me is like much more an expression of acknowledgement of defeat than it is a real approach of, trying to build anything, because those are the corporate media. So the thing we got to do, focus on, is like the kind of organizing work that actually builds a concrete base for left of center politics at the popular level. And there are a lot of dangers, and that's fraught, like, in a lot of ways too. Like the practice job talk I went to as a student I work with, who's actually studying, right, attempts to create or to build counter-hegemonic politics at the local level, like in a couple of the different areas in the city of Chicago. And it's just fraught, right? Because it's not like the communities that you go into are tabula rasa, right? And they're pretty well integrated into neoliberal organizational structures too. So I mean, for me, and this may be another old-fashioned or just kind of unimaginative way to go at it, but the labor movement is the key, because that's what gets you into contact with the working people who are active in their own communities, right, and with people who already, right, understand how to organize it and stuff like that. So,
Professor Reed.
I mean, I get all of it, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
You did.
Professor Reed, thank you for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for the interview opportunity. We appreciate it.
Oh, sure.